All right, let's jump right into this. Whenever we talk about the modern environmental movement, one truly monumental book always comes to mind, right? Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It is a critical, absolute milestone. But what if I told you it's really only half the story of our agricultural history? Today, in this explainer, we're going to uncover the hidden, century-long history of agrochemicals. We're going to explore the intersectional story of the communities that have borne the brunt of this toxic legacy, and, most importantly, how they fought back.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at the legacy of Silent Spring, a century of hidden harm, environmental sacrifice zones, the uneven green revolution, the rise of environmental justice, and finally, the ongoing chemical challenge.
Section 1. The Legacy of Silent Spring, taking us right back to that major turning point in 1962. When Rachel Carson published her groundbreaking work, she really brought these profound environmental stakes directly to the mainstream public. She wrote this incredibly powerful line: "Over increasingly large areas of the United States, spring now comes unheralded by the return of the birds, and the early mornings are strangely silent, where once they were filled with the beauty of birdsong." I mean, wow. It was an emotional observation, and it completely woke up the world to the hidden dangers of unregulated chemical pollution, specifically DDT.
And the really fascinating thing is how that single book catalyzed massive global regulatory impacts. Like it actually inspired international environmental policies that we still rely on to this day. We're talking the Stockholm Convention, which regulates persistent organic pollutants, the Rotterdam Convention, which manages the international trade of hazardous chemicals, and the Basel Convention for controlling transboundary hazardous wastes. Carson's work literally laid the foundation for tracking and mitigating these risks on a global scale.
Moving on to Section 2, A Century of Hidden Harm. Let's actually rewind the clock exactly 100 years to 1862.
Because way before modern environmentalism was a thing, agrochemicals were already rapidly proliferating. Back in 1862, alongside the abolition of slavery in the US, we actually see the rise of first-generation agrochemicals. Chemical inputs like arsenic were quickly adopted as labor-saving technologies. Basically, they needed to replace the forced manual labor that used to clear insects by hand. By the 1880s, the arsenic and fertilizer industries were absolutely booming. And get this, as early as 1916, France banned arsenic-based pesticides, but they just kept proliferating in the US. Then, in the 1940s, we see the emergence of second- and third-generation synthetic pesticides, which ultimately leads us right to Carson's big warning in 1962.
Now you might be wondering, who was actually out there applying these dangerous first-generation chemicals? Well, that heavy burden fell primarily on marginalized, non-white laborers. Whether it was black laborers in the South or migrant workers from Mexico, China, and the Philippines out in the West, these communities were forced to handle highly toxic substances with little to no educational support, and certainly no protective gear. It made pesticides an immediate, severe occupational hazard.
Which brings us to Section 3, Environmental Sacrifice Zones.
To really wrap our heads around this historical dynamic, sociologist Dr. Robert Bullard gives us an absolutely crucial framework. He defines environmental racism as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, whether intended or unintended, individuals, groups, or communities based on race or color. This is a really helpful, neutral lens to understand how these deep disparities were systematically built right into our agricultural and industrial infrastructure.
Because this wasn't just some abstract concept, right? This affected real families. Entire areas were literally turned into industrial sacrifice zones for the sake of agrochemical progress. Take South Baltimore, for example. Immigrant waterfronts there became epicenters of fertilizer and arsenic production, which led to some of the highest asthma rates in the entire country. And out west, the migrant farming communities in California faced constant, daily exposure in the fields. They effectively became sacrifice zones, fueling a booming agricultural empire without ever getting to enjoy the benefits of land ownership themselves.
Section 4. The Uneven Green Revolution. Let's look at how this shaped global economics.
At the onset of the Green Revolution, around 1943, pesticide patents were incredibly uneven. Check out these numbers. The United States held 367 patents. Compare that to 115 in England, 113 in Germany, and just 77 in France. So the big takeaway here is that this massive discrepancy gave the US incredible structural power. They basically got to dictate where and how agrochemicals were produced and utilized all across the globe.
And because of that total dominance in patents, U.S. companies began exporting these chemicals everywhere. Places like Mexico's West Coast were actually used as a giant agricultural laboratory to test out new agrochemicals. Plus, exporting this kind of chemical-intensive industrial agriculture became a diplomatic tool. It was genuinely used as a way to fight the red threat of communism. The idea being that increasing crop yields and spreading Western ideals through intensive agriculture would keep countries aligned with the West.
Section 5. Rise of Environmental Justice. How these communities finally started fighting back.
The legal and moral foundation for this grassroots movement actually came directly from the Civil Rights era, specifically Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This prohibited the use of federal funds to discriminate based on race, color, and national origins. This was an absolute game changer. It finally gave communities the legal framework they needed to advocate for both racial and environmental justice at the exact same time, fighting back against top-down federal projects that just weren't protecting them evenly.
And that spirit of collective action, it represents decades of intense, on-the-ground activism. We're talking everything from Black communities fighting PCB landfills in the South, which you can read about in Dr. Bullard's famous book, Dumping in Dixie, all the way to the landmark 1991 First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. That summit firmly established the principles of environmental justice, and those are the exact same principles that continue to guide activists to this very day.
Finally, Section 6, the ongoing chemical challenge. Listen to this number, 906%. Today, Latinx majority counties in California use 906% more pesticides than counties with fewer Latinx residents. Let that sink in. It's a completely staggering statistic and a stark reminder that this unequal distribution of environmental burdens, which, remember, started over a century ago with first-generation agrochemicals, is still very much a reality for marginalized communities living in agricultural sacrifice zones today. And while that harm is ongoing, the regulatory action has been notoriously, painfully slow. Look at first-generation harm, like arsenic. That persisted for decades after Silent Spring was published. The lead's arsenate ban in the U.S. didn't even happen until 1988. Now compare that to third-generation harm, like the superphosphate chlorpyrifos. Despite decades of lawsuits and fierce activism from environmental justice communities about its impact on children's development, it was only banned in 2021. And meanwhile, these chemicals have devastating impacts not just on human communities, but on wildlife too. They biomagnify in apex predators and cause embryotoxicity in vulnerable species like California's burrowing owls.
Which leaves us with a pretty critical thought to end on today. As we look at the food sitting on our kitchen tables right now, who is ultimately paying the true price for our agricultural progress? The legacy of Silent Spring taught us to look closely at the environment, but the century of hidden history we just covered teaches us to look at the people working the land. It is a complex, incredibly challenging history, and I really hope this explainer leaves you eager to learn more about the true cost of our food systems.